Bias is a bit like gravity in that it's everywhere. It's powerful, it's pervasive, it shapes our daily actions, what we do and we don't do, what we can do and can't do. But bias is also like gravity in that it's actually pretty easy to cope with. If you're just aware of it, if you're aware of your own bias, if you admit it to yourself, and if you have some kind of detached and self-disciplined attitude, you can work around it. You can have a good-humored attitude towards it. You can be willing to laugh at your own shortcomings, at your own faults, at your own biases. I got an email this morning from a professor of Sanskrit. Hi, Eliza. Someone who's read my work on and off over the years and has corresponded with me at different times, inviting me to talk about the problems that arise basically because of the fissure between Sanskrit scholars and Pali scholars. So Sanskrit is a language that's mostly associated with Hinduism. It also has a special role for Tibetan Buddhism, Mongolian Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism in general. Whereas Pali as a language is almost exclusively studied because of its significance for Theravada Buddhism and for the most ancient, most intact canon of texts about Buddhist philosophy, etc. that we've got. So Pali is also very important for places like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, etc. But as you can imagine, that is not an equal pairing. Sanskrit gets more than 90% of the attention, the fame, and the money, and Pali is getting an incredibly small amount. And, I mean, one of the advantages of doing this by YouTube instead of in the written word, I'm not bitter about that. I'm not resentful about that. I'm really not. And I also do not regard it as Western academia's fault or Western academia's problem. If anyone would be spending the money to support scholarship of a language like Pali, it should be a country like Thailand or like Sri Lanka, what have you. I don't think that a country like Canada has any mandate to spend a big budget on supporting scholarship of this language, nor to support scholarship on Buddhism of any kind in general. Why would we? It's not our problem. Meanwhile, countries all around the world right now seem to be very eager to make the civil war in Syria into their own problem and to take responsibility for that. Well, you pick your friends and you pick your enemies. And the last time Canada got involved in peacekeeping didn't work out very well. You remember a few decades ago we got involved in that civil war in the island of Cyprus? How did that turn out? But I digress. These questions, okay, Sanskrit and Pali. I was invited this morning to comment on the ways in which the predominance of Sanskrit scholars in this whole field distorts or reduces the quality of studies about Pali and Theravada Buddhism or what have you. I do not see that problem in terms of a technical problem with language. If you can read French, then learning to read Spanish is a technical problem. If you can read 18th century Italian, reading 16th century Italian is a technical problem. And when you go back to that period, even reading Italian from one province of Italy versus another province of Italy, it is going to be a problem, etc., etc. There are technical problems in the study of languages, ancient and modern. But that's not the problem. It's not the problem I want to talk about. Fundamentally, the problems are of bias. And some of those biases are positively expressed biases. But the bigger part of bias is in the questions that never get asked, the problems that never get raised, the things that never get problematized and pass unnoticed. And scholarship crucially depends on Socratic method and scrutiny in the simplest sense of being able to ask and answer questions of how do you know that? How did you come to that conclusion? Why do you assume that? How did you construct that thesis? Where are the pieces you put together to make that puzzle? Whatever it is. And questions of that kind that are so crucial to the progress of human knowledge and inquiry are actually profoundly unwelcome in Western academia and are often regarded as threatening. So this comes back to Sanskrit in the following peculiar way. If there's one lesson we learn from the history of the United States of America, It's that separate but equal doesn't work. You get people whose discipline and responsibility is to Sanskrit. And then they're put in charge of something to do with Pali as a kind of footnote. And they don't develop a robust familiarity with Pali as a canon. They don't become conversant with the political issues within the Theravada world. They don't become familiar with the types of vendettas, even the types of racism that exist within scholarship on Theravada Buddhism, and the politics that divide people. So while they feel self-confident, sophisticated, because they may be very sophisticated about Sanskrit and about all the politics that exist within, say, the Hindu study of Sanskrit, or the Tibetan study of Sanskrit in relation to Tibet, or some other Sanskrit field, they're actually jejune in reference to Pali, which is also a field they're asked to exercise scrutiny over. They're expected to have expertise in. And again, the problem is rarely a technical problem to do with language or grammar or dictionaries or vocabulary. Those problems exist too. But with that caveat having been stated, I spoke to a professor of Sanskrit face-to-face within the last year, and at several points in that conversation, I did the thing that basic scrutiny entails. He would make a statement, such as he made this very high praise of the old-fashioned scholar Rhys Davids, T.W. Rhys Davids. So this is fully 100 years ago, this scholarship. And I said, oh, well, I'm surprised to hear you say that. He made these very flattering statements about how wonderful the scholarship of Rhys Davids is. So, well, what is your opinion based on? What have you actually read? And, again, he's a Sanskrit scholar. He hasn't read much. He's never looked at the problems of the actual Pali translation and interpretation. And he also hasn't read anything in terms of the politics, the critique, and so on. And he also hasn't, compared one source to another and so on. Now, again, I didn't do this in a hostile way, but after he explained himself a bit, I told him a few jarring and disturbing facts about Rhys Davids and the type of bias he brought to the study of Buddhism. Now, among other things about Rhys Davids, he was anti-Semitic, and he constructed and put forward a theory that is known as Aryan race theory that was part of the history and development of, what became the Nazi Party in Germany. But before that was actually a political justification for British imperialism in India. That's a very strange and interesting story. It's covered briefly in an essay I wrote. I can provide a link or not. Nobody wants to read. This is YouTube. Come on. Reading. How 1986? I told him some of these general facts about Rhys Davids, his career, his political direction, and so on. These were not technical problems with translation. They were big, profound issues that you'd encounter in, the scholarly legacy of Rhys Davids. And this is not to say that I regard Rhys Davids' work as worthless. It's deeply flawed, but it's also interesting. I mean, it's also worth studying in all kinds of ways. But if I were teaching a course to undergraduates on it, I would start by laying out, look, this is who this guy was. These were his biases. This was his agenda. This is what his work accomplished. And let's also look at some of the potholes in the road. So this professor I was talking to, he was completely unaware of this. He had, in effect, no skepticism towards a Pali source and a Pali scholar. And he sort of said some further blandishments, saying, oh, well, that's very interesting, but, Rhys Davids was still a tremendously important scholar in the field. And I said to him, yes, but if you knew what I just told you in this conversation, then you would not have said any of the things you said just 10 minutes ago. You would have been embarrassed to say that, because now already I've given you enough information that you realize skepticism and procedural rigor are required for you to develop some kind of sophisticated and reasonable evaluation or analysis of who this scholar is and what he has to say about Buddhism, his contribution to Buddhist studies, Buddhist philosophy, whatever you're going to say. This came up again and again in the same conversation. This professor referred to the work of Rupert Gethin tremendously positively and the work of Bhikkhu Bodhi tremendously positively. And in both cases, I've actually written some critiques. I've written some articles that criticize Bhikkhu Bodhi. But let's stick with Rupert Gethin. If you say to me that Rupert Gethin is a great translator of Pali, and you are a scholar of Sanskrit, I would say to you, have you sat down and compared the Pali to the English? And the answer is no. Have you compared the English to the earlier English translation that it is based on and that it's trying to replace or perhaps challenge, or perhaps that it's derivative of? Perhaps. That's the sort of thing you learn through reading and through scholarship. I would like to imagine that within their own field of expertise, Sanskrit scholars do have this type of disciplined analytical interrogation of texts and sources, and do have skepticism about materials written in English until they have looked at exactly these types of factors. What's the earlier English translation? Maybe there's a German translation or an Italian translation. Not all of the precedents are in English. And what is the asymmetry between the primary source and the secondary source? What's the agenda of the author, and what have you? And what's amazing to me is that Sanskritists seem to just not ask any of these questions in relation to Pali, in relation to Theravada sources. Now look, maybe Hindu Sanskrit studies is full of this same kind of guileless, unsophisticated, uncritical reading of and adulation of received authorities. I doubt it. I think these are smart people who within their own field ask tough questions and have debates and do use Socratic method. But when they look at Pali, which really should be a separate field and is instead subsumed into Sanskrit, instead treated as a footnote within Sanskrit, they just throw all that aside because they don't want to deal with it. To give a really quick comparison from my own life, so I know a lot about, or I used to know a lot about the politics in Laos and Thailand and Cambodia and some other places. It would be ridiculous if I then turned my attention to Japan and just had a completely uncritical attitude, like, look, political corruption isn't a problem in Japan. No, I know about corruption in Laos and Thailand, and I know about violence and civil war, but Japan doesn't have any of these problems. Some people do that. I mean, we have this idiom in English, the grass is greener on the other side of the hill. In general, people who work on Sanskrit, if they work on Hindu Sanskrit, they may really regard Sanskrit as the language of the gods, and then they regard Pali as this sort of unfortunate digression in the history of India that they don't really want to deal with. So that's an attitude of contempt towards Pali, and I can understand it. If it's positively stated as a bias, if we're aware of it and we work around it, maybe we can still do research together. Maybe we can still make progress as scholars. But the problem is that contempt tends to be matched with this kind of, just this lack of scrutiny, of just regarding uncritically. I mean, I've had people say to me so many times in my life, but all the scholarship on Pali has already been done. All the translation has already been done. I don't think these Sanskrit scholars would ever say that about the Mahabharata. That's a Sanskrit epic, poem, drama, whatever you want to say. Even though textually, I mean, the Mahabharata is much simpler than looking at dense Buddhist philosophy in the Pali Canon. Or anyway, a lot of the stuff in Pali has real questions of translation, interpretation, understanding. These same Sanskrit scholars, so they may be a Mahayana Buddhist, they may be primarily engaged in Hinduism. This attitude, it doesn't hinge on linguistic technicalities. Several times I have talked to, again, these types of scholars, and you raise a simple issue like slavery. And they have no idea, they have no skepticism, and no sense of scrutiny about what they've been told in the past, that actually the material about slavery in the Pali Canon is nuanced, is complicated. The Pali Canon is not like Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. It contains some kind of ironical and interesting statements about human exploitation and slavery, and we can talk about that, and you could teach a whole course on it, and so on. It's interesting. But someone who's a Sanskrit scholar and who's already familiar with the type of political propaganda that exists within Hinduism in trying to misrepresent or selectively quote from Sanskrit text to serve some modern nationalist interest in India, those same people will look with no scrutiny whatsoever at a cynical Buddhist ploy to try to misrepresent the Pali Canon as if it were a radical socialist diatribe calling for great human equality and to tear down the system of oppression of the poor by the rich or something. And again, that attitude on the part of Sanskritists, who may in other ways be sophisticated people, it's not based on looking at the English next to the Pali, and it's not even based on looking at one English source next to another English source. So that is not the answer this professor of Sanskrit was expecting at all. But what I see as the main ghost haunting the field is precisely that people who are experts in Sanskrit are in positions of authority, of executive power over Pali and Theravada studies, and that they are guileless. They do not have any... They're guileless both in dealing with the lies that Buddhists tell them and in dealing with the rifts that exist within Buddhist scholarship. Because, Buddhist scholars hate other Buddhist scholars and so on. Buddhist scholars have their own agendas, some of them religious, some of them not so much. I think that's enough to cover in this one video. I have a lot more to say, but for the moment at least, it'll remain unsaid.